Hi guys, Martin Curry from Belief Media. Welcome to our second podcast titled Bo Corby, Northwest Airlines Flight 41 into Tehran. Hello, Martin Curry from Belief Media once again, and as always, Domenico, how are you?
Fantastic, thanks.
That's excellent. Bo Corby, Northwest Airlines Flight 41 into Tehran. Originally published, guys, on November 11, 2010. That was published at flightpodcast.com. And I recorded that with Ken Pascoe and Carleen Pettit. Carleen is a published author in America. She's a Delta A330, that's an Airbus A330 first officer. Ken Pascoe, he's, or at least was, pre the demise of Virgin Australia International, he was the fleet standards manager, the chief pilot, the training manager. He held a large number of roles, basically the most senior pilot they had in the international arm of the airlines, and a very good friend of mine. Unfortunately, he couldn't join us today for the purpose of recording because with the demise of Virgin Australia, this is an interesting story. He had to undertake, or he didn't have to, but he obviously left without a job, decided to fly British Aerospace 146s, and he's now in Europe picking up one of these horrible aeroplanes so he can bunny hop it back to Australia. So, the story behind this particular flight, Bo Corby was the captain of Northwest Airlines Flight 41. That was a DC-10 operating from Bombay, to Amsterdam on June 9, 2005. So at the time of recording, 15 years ago? 15 and a half years ago. He was at 32,000 feet in clear conditions. The master warning light illuminated. The master warning light is a light inside the aircraft. In those older DC-10s, it sat eye line with the pilot, basically, and it drew your attention to the master or another panel that indicated specifically what problem had presented itself on the aircraft. The DC-10 is quite a steam-driven, old push-button aeroplane. It's not like your modern fly-by-wire stuff with modern ICAS, and which is crew alerting systems and so on, all digitized. So Bo got the aft cargo fire warning indicator light, suggesting a fire in the aft cargo area. Now, Bo was in a position where he didn't have many options. His closest suitable airport, and suitable in terms of distance, was Iran. Northwest Airlines pilots are told Iran is an ocean. So after the Iranian Revolution of 1979, diplomatic relations between the US and Iran are obviously very poor. And American airlines do not want their pilots flying there. Okay, so this podcast is the only record ever made, actually, of this incident actually occurring. So it's a real historical record. It's a real historical document, and it needs to be shared back online. We do have issues with copyright on YouTube. People keep on reproducing this one on YouTube. So we send takedown requests virtually every other week to YouTube because somebody's copied it. It's very annoying.
Yeah, and because it's such a fascinating story, it is really interesting when you sit there and the way Bo tells the story, and that you're sort of it just brings you more and more into the story the more he gets into it, and then the situations he's facing, the dangers he potentially could have faced, and the way he talked his way and communicated to make sure that all came at ease. But it's a fascinating story, and I'm not surprised that people want to just hear it again and again.
Yeah, that's right.
Regardless whether you're interested in aviation or not.
I think part of the problem was when we essentially retired Flight Podcast, this episode was hidden for a great deal of time. And obviously it's taken me a significant amount of time to get it back online. So these people, when they publish it to YouTube, they'll usually caption it as, an archived footage, or, from the now defunct flightpodcast.com, whatever they want to say. But in every single case, it's theft. they're using this to bolster up their views and increase upon their channel subscribers and whatever else. So we send takedown requests to YouTube for every occurrence where this and all our other material is copied. You know, it's blatant copyright. We don't permit it. So how applicable is this to digital marketing? Do you want to start?
Look, I touched upon it already, which is the way the communications took place. There was many levels of communications, many groups of people to communicate with. There was the passengers who he had to keep at ease. There was the ground staff who he had to deal with. There was government officials floating in the background who he had to take into account. Every step of the way, requests were being made. He had to think, were these requests safe to adhere to, or how could they be done in a safe way? And it just shows the thought process. He goes through the thought process, which I find fascinating, of how he made his decisions. And it's a great way to see the thinking that took place, and also the way the communication is so delicate. He could have gone a very different way, and they could have turned out totally different.
He's very articulate. He obviously had an enormous amount of time to sit back and think about the experience, and then he put it down on paper. And when he spoke to us, he needed no prompting. We asked him to talk from beginning to end and talk for as long and as much as he could, because he is a good storyteller, and that's exactly what he did. He went into this story, and I think he spoke for about 45 minutes before taking a breath. And it's a fascinating story, remembering this was an international incident, certainly within America. It woke up the president. All the bells and whistles went off in all the FBI offices around the country, and the CIA started seeing, chatter in places that they hadn't seen it for a long time. It was a big deal, because when an American airliner lands in Iran, you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know if those passengers will be taken hostage, or the aircraft itself will be seized, or people will be put in prison. So there was a real big question mark over the whole thing. Thankfully, Bo, by way of not exclusively his communication strategies, but certainly his communication contributed in a very big way to the safe outcome and the safe operation or continuation of the flight.
And also the extreme friendliness of the ground crew and the people there in Iran.
Iranian people
They were just so
are not nasty people. That's the thing. I'm sure they've got a government that, is set on its wayward ways. It probably needs, deprogramming, some re-education as such. But the people there are just helpful, nice people. And Americans are... the Iranians certainly are a misunderstood group of people, and Americans as a whole do not understand the country. So the poor relations that the two countries have nothing to do with the people that live in those particular areas. So crewresourcemanagement.com is the place where we manage our crew resource management courses. It's part of a Human Factors program that we run internally as Belief Media. We have run for a number of years, and we provide services to the maritime industry, the transport industry as a whole, trucking, rail, and obviously aviation. If you're interested in some of our CRM or human factors related courses, we do make that information available on our website, but we've merged or morphed most of it in with our digital marketing packages now, and we present a lot of our material online and on these lovely couches. Now, when you were in the corporate world, you also, I made the note here, this was obviously a long time ago, I made the note here, you do incorporate sort of these non-technical skills or human factors related concepts into the corporate world by way of soft skills, don't you? They are essentially the same thing.
We call them the soft skills, yeah. Having dealt with, the teams were mainly made up of highly technical, very clever, very smart people. And you can get bogged down with the technical training, and because they naturally go that one, someone who's technical really enjoys and gets immersed in that world. And sometimes the soft skills can sort of fade away. And so we made it a very intent to get those skills up and make sure you had that more balanced view, especially if someone wanted to go into management later on from being someone who was very, very highly technical.
Yeah, Fascinating. All right, let's go into this. It is an audio-only podcast, so while it's playing, you'll be seeing a bunch of maps and images and whatever else, and quite frankly, transitioning through them is a pain in the ass. We might just stick them all on the screen at the same time and let it run through. We'll see you on the other side.
It is an interesting story, and I should probably precede the story by saying that in the DC-10 group, because that was the aircraft at the time we were using to go into Mumbai from Amsterdam, we were always told that when you're flying over Iran, you're basically flying over an ocean. You do not land in Iran. And it never came, I think, to anyone's consciousness that this would ever become an issue, but in this particular incident, it did. Now, the trip started, I guess you might say, uneventfully, with the exception that it started with one funny story when we were in Amsterdam leaving for Mumbai. My first officer, by the way, was a gentleman named John Walkman. John was a U.S. Air Force pilot, had a considerable amount of experience, flew C-130s in the military, very level-headed guy. And our flight engineer was a guy named Chase Osborne, younger fellow, but again, very accomplished. Both of these guys had really great personalities. So the trip started well. We kind of bonded, but just at the very first part of the trip, when we got on the crew bus, or we're getting on the crew bus in Amsterdam, Chase had forgotten something up in his room, and he said, "Bo, would you hold the bus for me before it leaves, because I need to run up to my room real quick." Well, of course, I got on the bus, and I went in the back and sat down and got immediately involved in a conversation, forgot all about Chase having to come. The bus takes off. I didn't give it another thought until I got to the Amsterdam airport and we signed in, no Chase, and then I remembered. Anyway, after about 40 minutes, Chase shows up, and he's coming up the escalator, and he looks at me and he says, "Bo, never leave your wingman." I thought that was rather humorous. So our trip to Bombay was uneventful. You've done it, Carlene, and I'm sure many of the people listening to this have as well. It's kind of a barren landscape as you go across there. We go across in the daytime. We get to Mumbai at about 10:30 at night. The weather down there, out over the Indian Ocean, can be really difficult at times. A lot of thunderstorms, and actually a lot of thunderstorms and buildups at night, which is something we don't experience here in the U.S. all that often. But after about I guess it was 26, 28-hour layover, we show up at the airport at midnight, and our route of flight's going to take us due west out of Mumbai. Then we turn northwest, go up over the Pakistan border, right west of Karachi, and continuing on in Tehran. As we left the Mumbai airport, what I can recall is we got into a lot of really nasty weather. It was very turbulent. I wouldn't say so much severe, but mostly minimally moderate, all the way until we got maybe 50, 60 miles west of Karachi. Then it smoothed out. We broke into the clear. We climbed up to, I believe it was 32,000 feet or so, and settled in for our trip to Amsterdam. I believe we'd had something to eat about that point once we were settled in. I remember crossing the Iranian border, and we spoke with Tehran control. And by the way, the controllers in Iran probably are the most understandable of any country we would traverse between Amsterdam and Bombay. So we'd made contact, and we were continuing up through Iran. And while we were talking, I remember being turned half sideways, saying something to John Walkman. And I just out of the corner of my eye saw a flicker, a light, and I wasn't sure what it was. And I just happened to look over, didn't see anything, and went back into the conversation. Shortly thereafter, it happened again, and I asked the guys, I said, "Anybody see any lights flickering?" And they said, "No, we didn't notice anything." So after maybe another couple of minutes, I happened to be talking to Chase, and I saw his master warning light on the flight engineer's panel illuminate the red master warning and extinguish just as quickly. So I said, "Guys, we got something going on with the airplane here." So we, at that point, decided we'd keep a real close eye on these lights. And sure enough, shortly thereafter, the fire warning light came on, the bell. The cargo warning, cargo fire indication illuminated. So we got out the checklist, accomplish the cargo fire checklist. We wound up firing one of the bottles. We have 3 bottles in this airplane, 2 that you can fire, and then the second one you fire an hour and 30 minutes later, it fires a 3rd bottle automatically, which you had no control over. At that point, I recall asking Chase to get out what we call the brick. Now, the brick is basically a package of JEP charts for all of the airports that we fly close to of a certain runway length that we can use as alternates should that be required. Certainly not desirable, but at least, we had some data out there that we could deal with. So we got out the brick. Chase was doing that. John was working the communications that night. I asked him to try to get a hold of dispatch and let them know what was going on. Well, on the HF that night, for some odd reason, the communications were absolutely horrible. It was mostly static. You really couldn't hear very well at all, even to the point where there was one point where all 3 of us were trying to listen to see if we got any response, and we didn't. Every once in a while, we'd catch them trying to call us. So the plan at that point was to divert to the Gulf, or we found an airport up in Turkey. Unfortunately, it was a military base, but it was actually, in terms of desirable places to land, it was the closest. So right at the point where we were figuring our divert headings and getting the INS set up, the fire warning light came on a second time with all the appropriate warnings, with the exception that we did not get the cargo smoke lights that we were told in school that if you get a fire light, you're going to have the smoke lights. Well, we didn't have the smoke lights, and that was really an interesting observation. So after having discussed that, we, of course, got out the COM again and went through the procedure for the fire warning, cargo fire warning. Accomplished it a second time, fired the second, and our last bottle. Now we're all intent on pretty much getting this thing on the ground. But in the meantime, I recall asking the purser to come up. His name was Jerry McGuire, a long-time flight attendant based in Detroit. Very, very capable gentleman. We got Jerry up front, and I explained to Jerry that we had some anomalies. One of the systems in the airplane had to do with the smoke fire warning system, and we felt it was probably a false warning. But what I'd like him to do is go back and do a cabin walkthrough and see if he could observe anything that perhaps would give us additional information on which to make a prudent decision here. At that point, we were going to land the airplane. There was no question whatsoever. We were landing, and our conversation in the cockpit was basically one in which would be the best airport to go to at this point in time. And Tehran was not even in the picture. This was not even up for discussion at this point. Jerry came back up after about, it seemed like an eternity, but probably 3 or 4 minutes, and he said, we've walked the cabin with our shoes off, and myself and 3 or 4 of the other flight attendants believe we smell faint traces of smoke right around row 29. And the floor is warm in this area. And I said, is it the right side of the airplane or the left side? Because the ducting for the number 2 bleed air comes up under the floor. And then I can't remember today, to be honest with you, whether it's the right side or left. And I believe Jerry's indication was both sides. I said to the guys, I said, look, this is not good. We'll push this thing up to max speed and continue on. And right at that instant, the fire warning came on again. We had no more bottles, and we had fired everything we had. So now I've got flight attendants in the back that believe there are some anomalies physically that they have observed. I've got a fire warning system that probably is false, but it's manifesting itself in a strange way. So I believe it was Chase that brought up the point, with the value jet fire, this thing happened really, really fast. And we're out of India. We don't know what we're carrying. We never know what we're carrying down in the hold. We have no idea. You're going from India to Amsterdam. So we thought about that, and I said, well, guys, I'll tell you what, we've got Swiss Air, we've got ValueJet, we've got Air Canada. They kept pushing the circuit breaker. I said, I hate to even bring this up, but Tehran is 84 miles. And the two of them got in a discussion about, well, if we went to Tehran, what are the consequences we're going to face when we get there? We discussed this, and I said to them at the time, I said, look, I lived in Iran for a year. I flew for Iran Air. I know the facilities. I know the airport. The only thing that is questionable with us landing there are the politics. I said, everything else, they probably would be able to help us. I can't remember who said it first. I think it was Chase. He said, Bo, you make the ultimate decision. He said, but my vote is we get this thing on the ground right now. This is not right. There's something really messed up. And I said, well, John, how do you feel about it? He said, Bo, I'm for getting it on the ground. He said, at least on the ground, we'll have a fighting chance. We can try to get out. If this thing is real and we delay too long, we'll run out of options. I said, well, I feel the same way. So we made the decision we were going to go to Tehran. And I told Chase, I said, Chase, get on the HF, try to get the company right now. See if we can get them on the horn. And we need more information. Everything we've got right here is pointing toward the fact that this is a machine that could potentially be compromised. I got 241 people on here. We need to get it on the ground. So give him a call. He tries to call him. I said, John, you fly the airplane at this point. I'm going to talk to Tehran control. So I got on the radio and I declared a mayday and told them we had a cargo fire indication declaring an emergency. We need to land in Tehran. And they asked me to say again twice because I think it probably took them by as much surprise as we had just experienced with this issue. So I repeated we wanted to come to Tehran. He said, stand by. So after a few minutes, by the way, when the firelight came on the last time, we could silence the bell. We couldn't get rid of the light. The light stayed on the whole time. So psychologically, out of the corner of your eye, you're still looking back at the light. After a few minutes, Tehran Control came back and said, Northwest 41, you go to Tabriz. Well, I had flown into Tabriz. It's an ex-military base, and this was not good. I wanted a lot of runway, although Tabriz was good runway. It was still further than Tehran. I didn't believe they'd have the facilities there that they would at Meherabad Airport. So I said, negative. We're proceeding to Tehran. And he said, stand by. While we're waiting, I asked him for a descent. I told him we want to descend to level 250, which he gave us. And then I asked, I would like to proceed direct to Tehran VOR, which he gave us. And at that point, I think we were probably about 70 miles from Tehran. Tehran was really close, and it was a clear night. So, all the while this was going on, we could see it, but I think the whole thing was happening so quickly for us that although it felt like it was happening in slow motion, it was probably all going pretty fast. So finally he came back and said, okay, Northwest 41, proceed to the Victor Romeo beacon, which is a beacon just, I believe, southwest of the airport. And Chase said, Bo, we got too much fuel. So now the question is, do you make a overweight landing or do you dump the fuel and maybe not be able to get it back? That was probably the first major dilemma as to what we do. And we were 70,000 pounds over landing weight. So we decided that we would go ahead and dump the fuel. We'd do one turn at the Victor Romeo beacon and then proceed direct for a vector to the ILS and land on runway 29 in Iran. In the meantime, Chase came back and said, Bo, there's just no way I can get dispatch. I hear him trying to talk, but it's just like almost pure static. I said, well, let's do this. Broadcast in the blind that we're landing in Tehran. I know they're not going to like it, but at this point in time, it's the most prudent thing to do, and we've made a decision we're doing it. And so he did. I'm not really sure that they got that message or not. I suspect they probably did. We completed the fuel dump checklist. We got the cabin prepared. We declared a yellow emergency for the cabin. John Walkman made a good suggestion that when we land, we leave the cargo door closed, get the fire trucks to come up, and look for evidence of fire. We do not evacuate. And that sounded like a really good idea because if we had, there would be injuries and it would just multiply the problems we would have to deal with. So we decided that we would park the aircraft and ask for stairs to get the people down. Now, although it had been a good number of years since I'd flown in there, I did recall at the time they had transporters, vehicles that would take passengers to and from the terminal. So I asked approach control, could you please send some transporters to the aircraft once we land and stand back and let us make sure that there's not a fire situation? And he said, Roger, we'll relay this information. So we made our final approach into Tehran. It was almost a surreal experience. It was 4:30 in the morning, completely dark. I remember 200 feet thinking, well, here goes my job. That actually went through my mind. But at that point, there wasn't anything we could do about it. I mean, we were landing, and we did. We turned off, and they asked our intentions, and I said, we'd like to go to a safe spot, and we want the fire trucks to follow us. Well, probably one of the most impressive things I've ever seen is the fire department at the Tehran airport. They must have had 50 fire trucks. I don't know where they got all these fire trucks. They were everywhere. They followed the aircraft from behind. They followed actually down the runway. We were on the taxiway. We went into a hard stand at the north end of runway 29. We stopped the aircraft. We kept the engines running, and I asked the tower to get the fire personnel to tell us if there were any indications of a fire in the cargo hold. And they did that. Their fire trucks had spotlights on them, and we could see them shining them all over the airplane. And they came back and said, Captain, no fire indication from outside. I said, okay. And I remember at the time telling Chase, let's get company on the horn right here, right now, and tell them what's going on if we can get them. And we actually did get a hold of dispatch. For some odd reason, at that particular location, at that particular time, we had clear communication, and we talked to the dispatcher. And I'll never forget his words. He said, well, at this point, you're an international incident. We have no support in Tehran whatsoever. And for now, you're on your own. Personally, that's when it really hit me that, oh God, what have we done? I mean, now we have a case where we have no fire indication, and we're on the ground in Tehran. We're compromised with the fuel. I got 255 total people to look out for. How are we going to do this? And I mean, this is all happening in a split second. It seemed like an eternity, but I remember saying to the guys, I said, all right, here's what we're going to do. And I kept the engines running because I knew that when the engines are running, they really wouldn't approach the aircraft. I remember that going through my mind. I could keep them back as long as the engines were running, which is kind of a stupid thought, but that, I guess, under a lot of pressure, you're thinking about a lot of stuff that doesn't make sense. But at any rate, I told Chase, I said, Chase, here's how we're going to do this. I want you to handle all the mechanical issues with the aircraft. That's going to be your assignment. And John, your assignment will be to handle all communications with the outside world. You keep us in touch with everybody you possibly can in any way you can. And I'll handle the politics and negotiate for whatever we have to do to get anything that you guys need to get us out of there. That was the plan. So having the plan in place, we saw the air stairs come up. We saw the people movers come out. And just before we shut down, I asked Jerry McGuire to come up, and I told Jerry, I said, Jerry, I'm going to send all of you to the terminal. And I said, I think we're going to have our hands full with dealing with the airplane. And our first priority will be to get the airplane in a condition to depart. In the meantime, we really need to rely upon you to take care of the people. Now, we've ordered the buses. They're going to take you to the terminal. He said, Bo, don't worry about it. We've packed up all the food and beverages on the airplane. We've got them in gray trash bags. We will take care of the people. He said, just try to keep me posted on what's happening. I said, Jerry, no problem. I said, but I'm telling you this. They're not keeping one person here. If they keep one of us, they keep 255 of us. He said, okay. So the flight attendants went down with the passengers, and they were taken to the main terminal. In the meantime, as they finished deplaning, one of the Iran Air personnel came to the cockpit. And I remembered from working there years ago that ground personnel have the same pecking order as pilots. You have the chief, who has 4 stripes, and then you have the first officer, who's a ground guy that has, a little less responsibility, et cetera, et cetera. The 2 stripers are usually the mechanics. But instead of gold stripes, they had silver. So I recognized that this guy was head of the ground operations, and when he came into the cockpit, I greeted him in Farsi. I think he was quite shocked. An American captain understood Farsi, so we talked a little bit in Farsi, and he was absolutely pleased that we had somebody here that knew a little bit about their country and their language. And by the way, one thing we also discussed before I shut the engines down with the crew and Jerry, the purser, I'm very, very quickly over the cultural issues in the country of Iran. Do not show them the sole of your foot. Never directly say no to anything they ask. It's always, yes, I will try. Things operate here in a different way. It'll get very frustrating, but when it does, we just have to be patient. It's very important to show deferral. Even though they're saying something to you that's totally illogical, whatever you do, don't raise your voice to them. Be courteous and respectful at all times, and that will get us out of here. Basically, when this first gentleman entered the cockpit, this kind of set the tone for the whole operation. The theory being that, if they're your friends, then they're more difficult to hurt a friend than it is to someone you really don't like. So it was real important that we show no arrogance whatsoever, that we were in a whole mode of deference, respect, and appreciation for anything that they did for us. So once the passengers were deplaned, they asked if we could move the airplane, and we're getting ready for the morning push. And they asked if we would move the airplane to another location on the airport, which I was a little apprehensive about, but decided there really wasn't a lot of choice. So we told them we would do that. And at that point in time, what I'll call a suit came into the cockpit, introduced himself as Saeed Akbari. I'll never forget. He was head of all ATC at the Meherabad airport and pretty high up in air traffic control in Iran, from what I gathered later on. He said he'd really appreciate if we could move the airplane. I said, sure. Would you like to ride in the cockpit? And he says, may I? And I said, well, of course you may. So stairs came back. We fired the airplane up, and they took us down to the main ramp. We parked right next to a whole slew of Iran Air 747s and shut down. Now we had to start negotiating. We were down. The people were taken care of in the terminal. And at that point, the only thing I could think of is don't concentrate on the end goal. Concentrate on the subject at hand and just keep knocking down all the reasons that they could come up with where we'd have to stay. And that's what we did. John stayed in the cockpit, kept trying on HF. I went down with Chase. The first thing we had to do was open the cargo door. And this is almost hilarious. We got a belt loader, and Chase and I walked up to the cargo door only to find out the directions were worn off the fuselage. When we opened the panel to look inside, all the labels were worn off. We're going, oh God, how do we open this thing? Because it's certainly not something that they teach us. And I thought that was very interesting. So I mentioned to Chase, I said, why don't we go in the cockpit and get the operating manual? Maybe there's something about the cargo door in there. He goes in back to the cockpit and comes back out with a manual and says, Bo, it's the only page that's missing. And we go, oh God. Anyway, I said, okay. While I'm here, we'll fiddle with this thing a little bit more. And about that time, Chase says, Bo, I found that somebody took it out and put it in the wrong place. It was about 5 pages back. So we got the directions up there out of the manual and opened the cargo door. There wasn't anything, just cargo. But now we'd fired all the bottles, and the next problem was we had 36,000 pounds of freight and baggage that we had to get off the airplane. First to inspect the airplane and then find a way to get this material back to Amsterdam, because without fire bottles you can't carry anything in the cargo hold. So those were the first issues that I started to work on. From that point, I asked Mr. Akbari if KLM had a representative, because I thought, well, Northwest KLM, Partners KLM flies in there, so perhaps this will be an avenue to get us some assistance. And sure enough, they did, and he did get a hold of the KLM agent. I talked to the agent, and he told me that he would do what he could. He said they had limitations. They had to be very careful because we were Americans. I didn't really get a warm and fuzzy feeling from that conversation, and thought thereafter that, if we're going to get out of here, the only way we're going to do it is getting every bit of assistance from the locals that we possibly could. The next issue we had was we had to have an inspection of the airplane, so we had to find a mechanic that was qualified in the DC-10. Now, in many countries, mechanics have type ratings on their mechanics license as pilots do on their pilot's license. So a mechanic that is type rated in the 747 can't work on a DC-10 unless he has a type rating in it. And I remember talking to the head mechanic that they sent over after a period of time, and he said, "Captain, I'm very sorry." He says, I can't work on DC-10. I don't know DC-10. And I said, "Well, can I see your license?" And he says, "Yes." So he showed me his mechanic's license. And I said, "You've worked on the British Trident." And he says, "Yes, Captain, I have worked on the British Trident." I said, "Well, the Trident has many cables and pulleys." And he laughed and he said, "Yes, the British way." I said, "Well, the DC-10 is the same theory. Lots of cables and lots of pulleys." He laughed really hard and he says, "Captain, I'll tell you what." He says, "I will look." He said, "I can't sign off, but I can look." I said, "Well, okay, that's a good step." So he goes off to do something. He's going to meet me back in the cargo hold with Chase here in a little bit. And I went to John Walkman and I asked John to get a hold of, tell dispatch that we're probably going to need someone to sign off the airplane. We don't have anyone here that's qualified to do it. So John got on top of that and wound up finding out that we had eventually a special FAA dispensation for the flight crew to do the sign-off, as long as we had a mechanic that would inspect it. So we had the guy to do the inspection. He had no problems with doing it, and we had a method of getting it signed off. So that problem was fairly well under control. Remaining, we had to get fuel, and we had to get a flight plan. So the next issue we had is, how are we going to get fuel? John had sent some messages back to the company regarding fuel. I wasn't sure at the time how that was going, but I did have a fellow approach us, a different four-striper, ground four-striper, and he said, "Captain, we have a problem." I said, "Okay, what's the problem?" He said, "No fuel." I said, "Oh, okay. Why no fuel?" He said, "Well, Captain, I don't know, just no fuel." I said, "Okay." I said, "Do you want cash?" And then he looked at me kind of funny. He says, "Captain, Iran Air always liked cash." I said, "Okay, let me see what I can do." And I talked to Chase and John, and I told them what the deal was, that we may have to have cash to get out of here. And one of them suggested we take up a collection among the passengers. And I thought, well, that probably wouldn't look too good. I went back to the cabin area where this gentleman had returned to, and I said, "Sir, I have an idea." He says, "Yes, Captain, what's the idea?" I said, "Well, how about if I can get my company to promise to pay you, and I will also sign a document that if my company does not pay, I will pay the country of Iran for the fuel." He says, "Captain, you mean personal?" I said, "Yes, I will. I don't need that much fuel, but I will give my word that you will get paid." He says, "Okay." So let me go. I'll be back. So about 45 minutes later, he comes back and he says, "Captain, is Northwest Airlines on CETA?" That's a communication system, probably about as old as DC-4. And I said, "Yes, they are." He says, "Okay, if you can get your company to send a promise to pay to Iran Air to this address, then I give you fuel." I said, "Okay." We had fuel. The next problem was a flight plan to get out of here. And I went to Mr. Akbari again, who was still there at the time, and said to him, I said, "Mr. Akbari, I really need to have a flight plan to leave Iran. How do I file from here? I'm having difficulty with my company and getting a flight plan filed from Tehran." He says, "Bo," he says, "you come with me." So we get in his car and we take off across the airport. This was a really interesting point for me, because the whole time I'm here, you got to understand, I've got so much adrenaline pumping through my body that it's just, I can feel my heart in my chest the whole time I'm there. And I wanted so bad to ask people things about Iran, but I didn't want to get ourselves in a situation where anything we said could be misconstrued. But in the car on the way there, he asked me, he said, what do you remember about Tehran when you lived here? I said, well, I remember the Paycon taxi. The orange taxis went north and south, and the blue taxis went east and west. And he laughed. He says, yes. He said, the Paycon is no more. It's gone. We don't have that anymore. I said, well, I really appreciate the hospitality that your people have shown us. This is absolutely wonderful. And I said to him, I said, I know the Persian people pride themselves in hospitality. And I said, it can't be equaled anywhere in the world. He said, Captain, when Iran had the bad earthquake several years ago, he says, I was in charge of all of the logistics. And many U.S. airplanes came to Iran with relief supplies. He said, and I always wanted to do something to pay back for this generosity. And he said, I'm very happy to be able to help your passengers and yourselves to depart. And I thought, man, this is great. So we get to actually it was the flight operations area, and it was interesting because I remembered working there. Now, you gotta understand, I was 24 years old when I flew for Iran Air, and there's a lot of things I didn't remember, but some things I had these incredible flashbacks, and the operations area was one of them. And I remember getting ready for flights there and checking in and getting paperwork and all. And it hadn't changed. It had not changed in, 27 years. So he tried to get me up to the flight planning area, and you had to go through immigration to get there, and they wouldn't let me go without a general deck. It's a procedural issue. And so I told Mr. I said, it's okay. I'll wait here in the crew area. He said, okay, you stay here. I'll be back. So I'm thinking, now, how am I going to get a flight plan? I have nothing. I have no paperwork, nothing from dispatch. So he comes down and he hands me a flight plan, and I look at it. He says, make it look like this. Well, it's an A300 from Tehran to Amsterdam, and I looked at the speed and altitude, and I looked at the waypoints. Crap, it's the same thing we'd been flying. So I just grabbed the flight plan and basically winged it. He filed that for us. And now we had a flight plan. We didn't have any paperwork, but we had a flight plan. I asked him if it was possible to get a fax from my company in Tehran. He says, okay, he says, I can arrange. I said, okay, fine, thanks. So we went back to the airplane, and I asked John if he wouldn't mind getting a hold of the company and seeing if they could fax or send over the CETA network a flight plan for us to get out of the country. He did that. Now, it didn't show up for probably another hour and a half, but at least he put the request in, and eventually we, in fact, got a flight plan. Now, Carlene, you'll remember it was basically computer paper, no, real long, but we had them on 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper. It was kind of a funny way of doing it, but it worked. And I gave John the flight plan that I filed and asked him to compare it in the end to what the company sent to make sure that, we're going to hit our waypoints at the appropriate times, which he did. So about this time, we saw a fuel truck show up. At this point, we're starting to cautiously believe that we might be getting out of here. But, and I caution my guys about this, that things in Iran don't really work like they do in many other parts of the world. The sense of logic is different. The fuel truck driver had a tractor and trailer, and the trailer was probably a 35, 40-foot trailer. Now, the trick was to line the trailer up along the leading edge of the wing, and the fueling station was on the back of the trailer. But there was a lot of ground equipment around the airplane, and their solution to that was to drive this truck between the engine and the inboard flap pylon, and there was about 3-foot clearance on either side, which in itself, if you had a good driver, would be okay, but under the circumstances, as happens in Iran, there were 3 or 4 guys on the ground, each giving him conflicting directions. And I think the scariest part for me during the whole experience, I believe Chase Osborne would say the scariest part for him, was the two of us watching this circus go on, trying to get the truck from the aft of the airplane between the pylon and the engine far enough out that he could make the turn and get the truck along the leading edge. He made 4 or 5 tries and finally, to our relief, got it. Only to find out that he only had half the fuel we needed. It had to all be done again. So I said to Chase, I remember saying to Chase, I can't watch this again. Can you take care of it? He laughed and he said, yeah, go on. I'll take care of it. I said, I just can't look at it again. Anyway, so I went back up, and one of the Iranians came up to me and said, Captain, we have a special request. And I said, okay, what can I do for you? He says, well, we need you to talk to someone. And man, the red flags went up, and I went, okay, who am I going to talk to here? So I really didn't have a big choice, and I said, okay, I'd be happy to talk to anyone that you want to bring out to the airplane to talk to us. He said, okay, Captain, in 15 minutes, yes? I said, okay, no problem. So I'm up in the cockpit working with John. We're trying to get this maintenance thing set up, to get the paperwork signed off, the logbook signed off. The flight plan had arrived, so we were checking the way we filed versus the flight plan we got from the company. And this gentleman came in and said, Captain, we're ready to have you talk to someone. I said, okay. So I walked out of the cockpit to the front door, and I looked down, and here's the press. And at that point, I went, oh, my God, okay. So I motioned for him to come back and up the stairs a minute and back in the foyer. And I said, sir, I said, okay. I said, you can ask me 3 questions. None of these questions can be political, because I'm not here on a political basis. I'm here as a distressed aircraft. But you can ask me any 3 questions you want that are not political. He said, yes, Captain. I said, what are you going to ask me? He said, Captain, we're going to ask why you came to Iran. I said, okay, that's a fair question. And then he said, and Captain, I am going to ask you how you were treated by the personnel at Iran Air. So I said, well, that's a good question, and I have no problem answering that one. He said, and third, Captain, he said, can you say something good about ATC? Now, it turns out that he was an ATC controller, which I found out later from Mr. Akbari before I left. And I thought, there are some politics in this. It was kind of interesting. So I said, okay, I can do that. So I went down and faced the press. Now, what he asked me and what he said, I couldn't pick up all the Farsi, so I don't know what he said in Farsi. I got bits and pieces, but I don't really know what he said. Other than the fact, he asked me the question, and I said, well, as we came to Iran because we had a cargo fire indication. It was a very serious situation, and the safest thing to do would be get the aircraft on the ground. He said, okay, Captain. And he said, now will you tell us how you've been treated by Iran Air? I said, yes. I said, first of all, the Persian culture, of any culture in the world, is best known for its hospitality. And having lived in Iran for 1 year of my younger life, I'm happy to see that the hospitality today in Iran is no different than it was 30 years ago. It's the same, and we appreciate it. In terms of Iran Air, it has been extremely professional, extremely helpful. And we're an Iran Air airplane to be in the same distress situation with our country. I can only hope and believe that the Iran Air personnel would be treated with the same amount of respect and assistance. And then he asked me, okay, and Captain, he said, how were the ATC services coming to Tehran? And I indicated to them that when a pilot is in distress, the pilot's link to the earth is the controller, and that the Iranian controllers that we experienced that night, and in fact in all the times we fly over Iran, were the most professional. And they did such an outstanding job that it actually calmed us down in the cockpit. Well, then all the Iranians there, the news media, they started talking amongst each other. So it must have been a decent answer. So at this point, we had the maintenance issue resolved of how we were going to do it. We had fuel. Fuel was on the airplane. I think we bought 40 or 50,000 pounds of fuel. We had taken care of all the sundry items we had to do with the flight plan, et cetera, et cetera. We got down to the passengers. Now, just as we're getting ready to go, one of the fellows came up and said, "Captain, I want to clean your airplane." And he was a three-striper. And I said, "No." I said, "You don't have to do that. Our airplane is just fine. We'll just load her." He said, "No, Captain. No, Captain. I clean the airplane. No charge. No charge." I said, "No." I thought, "I better take it." I said, "Okay. We'd really appreciate that." So about 15 people came on board the airplane, and I swear to God, that airplane looked better than it ever did, ever. It's Northwest. It was absolutely spotless when they were done. At that point, we had to finish up the maintenance paperwork, and we got on HF, and it was terrible again. We'd get about 2 words written in the logbook, and we'd lose them, and we'd have to get them back again. And the whole thing, it took us 45 minutes to get the paperwork done. In the meantime, I asked them if the passengers, if they could get the passengers out to the aircraft. And they said, "Yes, Captain, but first we'd like to offer your crew something to eat." And I said, "Well, we've had some food on the airplane that we're going to have, but we really appreciate the hospitality." And they said, "Well, Captain, we fed your people." They had actually taken, I can't remember how many carts it was, but they showed up at the terminal with breakfast for all 241 passengers plus crew. It was absolutely incredible. Meantime, they sent the people out. We get the airplane boarded up, and we're just about ready to go. And the funny little guy that I did the interview with came up again. He said, "Captain, before you go, I need 3 Americans." And I went, "Oh, my God." And that's when my heart jumped through my chest, because we had gone through all of this. We're ready to go, and they want 3 Americans.
Well, I think 3 Americans swap for a DC-10 is a good deal.
I'd have left the DC-10, but I wasn't about to leave 3 Americans.
Okay, I'm so sorry to interrupt. Go.
Yep. Well, at any rate, I said to him, I said, "I'm sorry, I can't do that." He said, No, Captain." He said, "We want to talk to 3 Americans." I said, "Okay. What do you want to talk about?" He said, No, Captain. We just want to do the same we do with you. We want to ask some questions. I said, "Okay. I'll tell you what." I said, "You can talk to 3 Americans, but they can't leave the stairs. They must stay on the stairs. Okay?" He said, "Yes, Captain, no problem." I said, "And they're going to talk to the news media, correct?" He said, "Yes, Captain." And he said, 3 Americans with passports. I said, "Okay, you go down and get the news media ready. I will bring down 3 American passengers." He said, "Okay, Captain. I meet you at the bottom stair." I said, "Okay." Well, the first class was loaded already. All the people were in there. And I said to them, I said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I have a really odd request. The people here would like to have 3 people talk to the press in Iran. They want 3 Americans with passports." I said, "If you are Jewish, I do not want you to come with me. If you come with me, you're only going to answer 2 questions. Do not elaborate. And I will be there with you the whole time. When it's time to go, I don't want you to argue. I don't want you to say too much. Nothing political. When we're done, we go right back up the stairs and the door gets closed. I need 3 volunteers." So I think 4 people raised their hand. I selected an older gentleman, a older lady, doesn't seem older now, and a young college gal. And we went down the stairs together, and I waited there with them, and they asked them the same question. "How were you treated by the Iran Air staff in the terminal?" "Yes." "Is this your first trip to Iran, and how do you like Iran?" And they all elaborated that they really appreciated the hospitality they got. Everybody was so kind to them and nice to them, and That basically was it. So we go back up the stairs, and I look around the airplane. I've got no persons on the airplane, and the stairs starts to back away. And I'm thinking to myself, we're actually going to get out of here. This was the first point when I realized consciously, on a conscious level, that we were going to leave. It was such an incredible relief, you have absolutely no idea. Jerry closed the door. I hopped up in the cockpit. It was funny because the three of us just looked at each other for a while. And I don't think they believed we're getting out either, but we did. So I said, man, let's not waste any time. So we started engines. By that time, the 747s all had done their push, so we had an empty ramp. It was just us. And we taxied out, did all the checklists, and were cleared for takeoff and roared down the runway, and the rest is history. That was it, until we get up to altitude. And the first HF question that came to us was, do you know the disposition of the blue box? And we all looked at each other and went, what blue box? Well, then as we traveled further north, we finally got in ACARS communication. We got an ACARS, do you know the disposition of the blue box? So we typed back, what blue box? And we never heard another word about it. And when I got back to the States, I contacted the fleet director, and I said to him, I said, I want to know what we were carrying on that airplane in a blue box. And he got back with me about 2 weeks later, and apparently we'd been carrying probably about $4.5 million worth of diamonds and gold on the airplane in this blue box. Now, I might add that every bag, every piece of cargo that we were carrying got to Amsterdam the next day. Some on KLM and some on Iran Air. That's the story, and I know there are a lot of pilots in the industry that think that move was probably fairly idiotic to go into a place like that. But it wasn't a decision that was made lightly. It was not a decision made by myself alone. It was a crew decision. We felt at the time, under the circumstances, with so many unknowns, that the most prudent thing to do was to put it on the ground immediately. And we discussed this, that in the history of cargo fires, delay in making a decision is oftentimes a wrong decision. I think that the fact that I had lived in Iran and flew for Iran Air probably gave me personally more confidence that taking this action as opposed to flying another hour and 30 minutes somewhere else, that night, at that time, under those conditions, I felt secure that we could do it. And we did. I don't think it made our company very happy that we did, but it was successful. And I think the success of the operation speaks for itself.
Bo, you know what? I have to tell you that any pilot who tells another pilot that their decision was the wrong decision and they weren't on that airplane, they don't know what they're talking about. You know, until you're there, I agree with you wholeheartedly on the fire on an aircraft. And if an aircraft's burning, put it on the ground. And had I been there, I wouldn't even hesitate to, concur with going. Which adds another question. How do you think they would have reacted if one of your crew members had been a woman?
I don't think that would have been a problem because there are female pilots in Iran. I discussed this with a couple of the crew members. They have now female pilots. There's some other things I didn't add in the story. Along about daylight, 6 o'clock, maybe 6:30, we started to see these uniformed personnel show up. As I was walking past one, I noticed they had epaulets on. They were in uniform, like a military uniform, but the epaulets had Quranic scripture written on the epaulets. And I asked one of the Iran Air personnel who they were, and he said they're the lookers, and they're the enforcers of Islamic law. So I don't think the fact that a woman as a pilot would be a particular problem with them, but you have to understand that the Iranians are much more advanced than people in America would like to consider them. These are not stupid people. Let me tell you, they are extremely bright. And they have some cultural differences. There's no doubt about it. But the general populace, Carlene, is not fanatical. There are fanatic factions, but we have those too. I mean, we've got the skinheads. We've got the Ku Klux Klan, you know. They have them too. They're just in a different way. So was it if it were a female pilot? No, I don't think that would have been a problem at all.
Yeah. Do you think that a lot of your fear was, or apprehension going in there, was more out of the fear that the company instilled in you that this is a forbidden territory? Dispatch saying you're on your own and you've created an international incident. Did this turn into an international incident? Or was just theatrics from that dispatcher?
I think and I talked to the dispatcher afterwards. I think what happened was they were in total shock that anyone would even consider going in there. I don't think they knew what to do. It was interesting because he told me that at about 6:30 in the morning, they got a call from the FBI saying, do you know you have an airplane down in Iran? And they went,
really?
Duh. Yeah, I learned that from the dispatcher and the chief dispatcher. So people in Washington knew this was going on. In fact, a while back, I was, after Northwest, I was working as a fleet manager for instructor hiring at Alteon Training, a Boeing company. And I was hiring instructors for the 787. One of the people I met there was an AWACS pilot and in the reserves, and he was doing duty in Iraq. During the course of the interview, we were discussing his experience and so forth, and he was mentioning that he was in the AWACS airplane over Iraq, and I said, did you have any interesting experiences? And he said, yeah, I did. He said, there was a Northwest Airlines airplane that went into Tehran. And he said, boy, I'll tell you, he says, that was an intelligence bonanza. I said, why? He said, the whole country lit up. He said, we reaped information out of that was absolutely fantastic. I said, well, turns out I was a captain on that flight. He says, no kidding. I said, yeah. My fear, Carlin, was not so much there was some apprehension about what the company was going to do about it, but my fear was that we weren't going to be able to pull this off. And I'll be honest with you, I think if someone had gone in there, a pilot with an arrogant frame of mind that was going to order the Iranians around and how to do things, it doesn't take much to make them mad and upset. It's very likely that the outcome could have been different. But my fear primarily was getting all the resources together to be able to get out and the safety of the passengers I had on board. That really was the scariest part for me.
Right. Did you at any time think that they would do anything to all the passengers?
I never thought they would do anything to all the passengers. I wondered if any of the passengers would be singled out.
Right.
I mean, at the very end when they asked for 3 Americans with passports, that was probably the most scared I was the whole time, and trying to figure out instantaneously what I was going to do about it. But I was determined that, they had to deal with all of us. They wouldn't deal with 2 or 3. Nobody left the airport, not with me flying. No one left the airport to leave anybody behind. And I remember that going through my mind. We're not leaving anybody here.
Now, the backlash from Northwest, did they, I heard very little, if anything, about this.
No one heard about it. No one heard about it. And it was really interesting in the sense that any incident, and from working there, any time there's any kind of an incident, there's a debriefing of the whole crew.
Right.
We went into a hostile country. We were there for 6.5 hours. We observed everything that was going on at that airport. Now, wouldn't you have thought someone would want to know what we saw?
You would think so.
But we were never debriefed. But with the exception of the station manager in Amsterdam, we sat down in the first class section for about 15 minutes and told them the story, leaving out tons of details because I think we were so wired at that point that I don't even know if I was coherent, but there was never a debriefing. They just didn't want to know.
How long was the whole duty period from leaving Bombay to Amsterdam?
I think we were up probably 20 hours.
It's a long day.
It was a long day. But I think, Northwest had an airplane stuck in Moses Lake, Washington longer than we were in Tehran.
They probably didn't have the adrenaline levels.
Exactly. They didn't have the motivation to get out.
That's probably right. Although Moses Lake is not too far from Tehran, I think. I don't know.
You mentioned that Northwest Airlines considered Iran an ocean, and I know you wrote a report addressing threat and error management, and as part of that report you wrote that Iran is not an ocean. I'm wondering if Northwest introduced any policies and or procedures to mitigate the risk of flying into unfamiliar and, in your case, hostile territory, and was it something that the training department addressed?
No, they did not at the time, and it was something that I discussed with the director of training and the fleet manager, that we really could use more guidance on do's and don'ts of the countries we fly over. I guess what I'm saying is, if you're going to fly over a hostile country, you need to know as much about that country as you possibly can, and the culture, because all of these knowledge is power. Knowing how to react to your adversary, being able to anticipate what is going to make them cooperative or uncooperative, how you're going to insult them or not insult them. All of these are facets of success. And to say, well, we're never going to land there, well, you don't know if you're ever going to land there. If you're going to fly over somewhere, there's a chance that you could land somewhere. Now, would the chances be infinitesimal? Of course. Would they be so small that actuaries would say that it's never going to happen? Well, I think it's happened enough in the industry that you can't predict. What you can do is be prepared. I mean, another good example is the DC-10 with Sioux City, Iowa. Whoever would have thought that an engine would separate in a manner that would cut through all the hydraulic lines, and you'd lose all hydraulics to the aircraft. And it's real interesting that, take that particular incident, for example. What they had to do is use the throttles to work the phugoid oscillations in the aircraft to a point of stability. And when that happened, I was shocked that it was like these guys invented this thing. They didn't invent it. Every airplane's had to experience a phugoid oscillation from the day it was built. And it also had to be stable. All oscillations have to dampen to stability. Now, these guys intuitively figured that out. Unfortunately, it was with a live flight. But being prepared is being subjected to these kinds of information bags that if you get in trouble, this is what you can do. You're never hopeless until a wing falls off, and then there's nothing you can do. But up until that point, you work every piece of knowledge you have to get out of a situation. That's what we did there. We used every single piece of knowledge we had collectively, and that includes the cabin, to get that airplane out of there.
Big piece of collective knowledge that you had that helped enable you guys to get out there was your awareness of the culture. And that in itself would be something very easy for any company to put in their operations manual, something about the different cultures that we, as you said, that we fly over, which we don't have.
Exactly.
Thanks for your story, by the way, because for me personally, I went in and out of Tehran almost every month into Meherabad from 96 until probably, I think it was early 2000, or was it mid to late 2000 where they went to the new airport? Just because we only did turnarounds, but, getting anybody in Iran to do something in an hour was always fun to watch.
Absolutely.
I mean, lovely people. I live next door to Iranians in Dubai. Man, they could party.
Oh, yeah.
We used to go to a barbecue at their house next door, and they'd invite us to come around for dinner at about 10 o'clock at night. The drinking would commence, and the food went on the barbecue about 1 a.m. Anyway, yeah, it was very interesting to listen to you. And for me, of course, just identifying with your sense of apprehension of going in there, I guess it's probably similar to if we were flying. The funny thing is, these airlines, I use that term generically, but they fly across these countries that they consider hostile, and they'll consider an ocean. But they do so for financial advantage. You could just as easily fly around Iran. It's just a lot of money and a lot of fuel.
Absolutely.
So you've got to expect to expend some of that income that you make by flying those shorter routes, mitigating the risk. Whereas it seems to me, in your case, the operations at some point just sort of said, no, we'll just never land there.
Yeah,
Problem
exactly.
solved.
And that was the whole philosophy that we were
breaking.
That's a good word. I suppose that there are people that think that decision was made lightly. It was not made lightly. We had great angst in the cockpit about doing it. We felt that it could be a false warning. But when you add up all the other times it wasn't, where there actually was a fire, and we had to ask the question, what is good judgment? To me, good judgment is the consistent selection of the least risk alternative, considering economic effect. What that means is, safest thing to do is to get it on the ground, go to the Gulf. Because I'm sure it would have cost the company a lot less money for us to land in Dubai or Bahrain or wherever than it did to land in Iran. But at the same time, under the circumstances, with the information that we had at hand, and I'm sure there are pilots that would say, well, yeah, they're flight attendants. They'll say it just because they're flight attendants. With the attitude that, these people in the back are a lower class than us in the cockpit. You can't trust them all the time. You can't believe them all the time. That's a very dangerous attitude. And in my experience, by far, 99.9% of the flight attendants, they know the airplane. They know the sounds. They know the smells. They know everything about that environment because they live in the environment. They know when something's wrong. Can they get scared and make a bad judgment? Sure. But I didn't land because the flight attendant said that. I landed because I had a crew that agreed with it. I had anomaly in systems going on at that time. It was just one of those circumstances where, in our minds, it was the most prudent thing to do. And we did it. And we got it out.
It's almost a moot question, Bo, but obviously, we'll take the obviously word away. Same circumstances, same thing again. Make the same decision, do the same thing?
Having to do it again, having had this experience, I don't know if it could happen again. The key was communications. Another facet that we could have had is a maintenance controller saying it's a false warning because. If someone said to us, it's guaranteed a false warning, or the presentation, the way you've told us, indicates a false warning, then you may have less risk gone to the Gulf. But we didn't have that. Now, under exactly the same circumstances, would I make the decision I made? Well, I can tell you this. If I had a different crew member on board, maybe I would, maybe I wouldn't. Because a crew is dynamics. You make the decisions based on the crew you operate with, and you can take a crew of 16 people, change one person, and that's a totally different crew. And I think all of you, having flown with the airlines, understand that concept. With these guys, under the same circumstances, I'd definitely done it again. Not a problem, because I felt it was the safest thing to do.
That's an interesting concept. If you had a crew that, say your first officer was a little bit arrogant and your second officer had an attitude, that's interesting that played a part, that you were comfortable going in there knowing that they would be okay in there.
Certainly not something we thought to think about.
Yeah.
That's right. Well, these are all judgments that you make, and sometimes you don't make these decisions on a conscious level. Sometimes these decisions are made or influences on the decisions you make are sometimes subconscious. When people say, I got a warm and fuzzy feeling, well, how do you define that? I felt okay going into Tehran because I had a warm and fuzzy feeling with the people I was working with. Extremely competent individuals. And I knew I could trust them. I knew I could rely on them. I knew they both gave good advice. And getting out of a situation really is a matter of, having all the information you can get and sifting through the quality versus unquality information, then making a prudent decision based on the quality of the information you got and the support you get. I had a great purser. I had a wonderful second officer, and the first officer had really, really good experience and was level-headed. He was like a rock. So I felt with this crew, it would work. And I took that risk and that chance. I felt the risk was worth it. What's really interesting is when people make decisions, I keep going back to the least risk alternative. When you think about that, we deal with risk every day. You'll never get on an airliner when there isn't some kind of risk. In fact, every flight A to B, no matter how long or short, there's a ton of risks. But if you have, the more guidance you have, then the easier decisions are to make because you have framework within which to work. If there's a situation you face that people have ignored or they purposely want you to know nothing about because they're afraid you might do something that they consider extremely stupid, then your decision becomes a lot harder. Now, the question is, what would have happened if we'd have decided to go to the Gulf and the fire was real? First of all, you don't know what's burning. I may say, well, that cargo compartment will contain a fire for an hour and 2 hours or 3 hours or whatever. Well, how about a value jet? It depends on what's burning as to how long that particular container is going to be capable of containing the fire. So now you're working with unknowns again. I don't know if there's anything burning, and if there is something burning, I don't know what it is.
Well, you've got 2 warning lights, so you know there's something happening down there. And the thing is, history has shown us with a lot of these fires, well, a few of these fires, the particular ones, that it actually didn't matter whether you went to Dubai or Tehran. If you'd had the worst of history's fires on there, you wouldn't have made either airport.
Correct.
So you're on borrowed time the whole way. And the question is, how far are you willing to push it?
That's exactly right. I mean, how big are your balls? And
pretty small when the end's on fire, I tell you.
That's right. My vote, get the pig on the ground, because you're much better off trying to negotiate your way out than you are having to deal with something in the air. It's not that I'm afraid to fly. I'll fly anything, anywhere, anytime, almost.
Do you think part of your hesitation also may have been that you were the first person to land in Iran, or the first United States jet with the United States crew to land in Iran since 1979? It was the first American crew to have landed in Iran in 26 years.
It's interesting you say that, because at the time, in the heat of battle, it never entered my mind until about 200 feet and in the flare. I can remember my mind saying, just as I'm flaring for touchdown, I can remember my brain saying, holy shit. That's exactly what I said. I said, holy shit. And then shortly followed by, we just landed an American airplane in Tehran. We're probably in some really deep trouble.
When they asked you to move the aircraft from one area to another, that must have been awkward for you, not knowing where they were going to take you. Wouldn't it be ridiculous to suggest that at that point they might instigate some sort of military action?
Exactly, and I can't say that didn't go through my mind when they, that's why it's real interesting. And I think I said to my guys before we shut down, I said, and I can't remember exactly the words I might even have said. I think it came up in the conversation. It's been a long time. I said something to them in the effect that whenever you see something that doesn't really look good, give it time before you react. Because these people usually get the job done. It's just in a very different way. Well, when they wanted us to move the airplane, that did concern me. I didn't know where we were moving it to until we got the engines running and started moving. And I think Mr. Akbari said, we're going down, they had a little follow me truck that we followed. And I could see he was heading toward all these other airplanes. And when he turned in the taxiway toward the ramp, I felt some relief. Because, if they're going to do something to the airplane, they got all these other Iran Air airplanes are going to hurt too. So that was a relief. But I did think about that. In fact, everything that came up that you didn't understand, you'd get that rush of, uh-oh, this can't be good.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
And it's really interesting because I think for an American pilot flying for Emirates or a foreign airline that goes into Tehran every day, it's not a big deal.
No, absolutely. And I mean, one of my friends is of Jewish descent with an Australian passport who obviously lives in the Middle East and flies in and out of Iran and Saudi.
Exactly.
Not that I'm really aware of that, but.
Well, the other thing is I knew I had Jewish neighbors in Iran. I had a fellow that lived on the flat below me was a Baha'i, which is a religious sect that's somewhat persecuted in Iran. But I think that we as Americans live on an island. We hear a lot about what the respective governments do to each other. We hear a lot about things such as the evil empire and all these terms about another country. When you really get down to it, it's over such small things. I think if more Americans would go see these places and try to live in a different culture where all your yes-nos go to maybe and get through that period of culture shock and get to a point where you really start to understand people, it'd be a much better world. And a lot of our fears come from that. I mean, the Iranian people at heart are very, very nice people. Hospitality like you can't believe. They're wonderful people. They're just different.
Bo, it's really hard to argue with success, and taking a holistic view, it's clear that you did everything right. But looking back now, with the benefit of hindsight, what would you have done differently?
I think we were so excited and so intent on getting out of there that I was really remiss about keeping the passengers informed, which is part of my duty and responsibility. But honest to God, I was overwhelmed out there, and I just relied on the fact that Jerry would take care of the problem. I just wish that I had the presence of mind to contact him 2 or 3 times and see how he was doing. And I didn't do that, mainly because we were completely overwhelmed. However, at the same time, the ground service personnel at Iran Air did assure us that passengers were fine, there were no problems, and told me that they had actually taken them food. I just wish I'd have said something to Jerry during this process. But, you make mistakes, and that was one of mine.
What were some of the other mistakes then? Or perhaps not mistakes, but things you might have done differently? And you did mention the fuel issue earlier on.
Well, I think maybe I wouldn't have dumped so much fuel. I dumped down to landing weight. If I hadn't dumped so much, it wouldn't have been a fuel issue. I could have gotten at least to the Gulf or somewhere else. But my thinking was, I got to get them to Amsterdam. My whole focus was get these people to their destination. I think, having to do it over again, perhaps I would have kept more fuel than I do it. That's one thing I'd thought about several times. I think the other thing is that I would have probably fought harder. I talked to the fleet manager, and by the way, he and I never got along. We were not friends in any respect, but I did go talk to him about getting sat phones, one for each airplane. Because if we'd have had communications, it would have been a lot easier for us to deal with this. And the key is communications. I mean, there's probably a lot of resources that went on behind the scenes that we didn't know about. As a result of that, our adrenaline level was running on full the whole time. I think if we'd have had the capability of communicating with the company, or the outside world, perhaps in this case, we would not have been under as much stress as we were, and we would not have felt so isolated. We were alone, and there's no doubt about it. In our own minds. I'm sure we weren't. The FBI knew we were there. I'm sure the military knew we were there. And I don't know what went on in Washington. The president got a wake-up call.
Bo, think about it the other way. If you did have communication with dispatch, and they're feeding you this information that the FBI just called, wouldn't that put another element of stress on you?
That's an interesting concept, Carlene. I hadn't thought about that, but it could be that would have actually elevated this thing in my own mind more than it needed to be at the time. That's a good point. That's a good point. All I knew is I wanted to talk to somebody.
Have you ever spoken publicly about this before?
No, have not. And I have to be honest with you, I started in this business when there was no CRM. And I believe that without the training that we've had, and it's not so much the training on how to do something. The most important aspect of CRM is to raise a level of awareness of how to get the most out of people and resources.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's what it's all about. The days of the swashbuckling leather coat, high boot pilot is over. Yet we still have personalities out there flying airplanes that gravitate to that modus operandi. There would probably be a lot more if we didn't have the training that we have in CRM, crew resource management, or situational management.
Yeah, Bo, thank you very much for joining us. This was absolutely fascinating, and I enjoyed it, and you've brought a lot to the table, a lot of us to think about out there with flying over unfamiliar terrain and different cultures, and it's been great. Thank you very much.
Well, you're quite welcome, Carlene, and to all of you, and particularly your readers. Appreciate this opportunity to relate this little story, and hopefully someone out there finds something of value in it that they can carry with them in their career. Quite welcome.
Thanks, Bo. So there you go, guys. That was 15 years ago, 2005. There are a large number of outtakes and all sorts of things from that episode. In fact, we spoke to Bo for well over 2 hours. I think we stuck in about 45 minutes there or something. So at some point, we're going to make that raw audio available because he is a fascinating guy. He's got a lot of stories to tell, and he's still flying. To this day, he's still flying. He's flying a family around PC-12 or something somewhere in America. We're friends on Facebook, but I don't take much notice on Facebook. So, yeah, I don't really know what's going on. We will have quite a few more aviation-related podcasts published over the next, 2 or 3 weeks? Probably another 4 or 5 podcasts, really, on aviation specifically.
Yeah, there's another 4. Yeah, 5, you're right.
Yeah, and look, quite frankly, they are really interesting. Who do we talk to? The next one we do is, what's the next one? I can't see the board here.
John Bartel.
John Bartel's QF 30. He was captaining a Boeing 747 and an oxygen cylinder came loose, bounced around the first class cabin of the airplane, punctured a hole in the side of the airplane and blasted out into the ocean. The airplane suffered a rapid depressurization, or rapid D. Technically it wasn't rapid. And he diverted into Manila. So we look at that as part of, communication strategies, different threat and error management strategies and so on. That's a fascinating one. What's the next one?
We wrote down to John King from King Schools.
John King has had a hand in the training of roughly 50% of all the pilots in America through kingschools.com. He and Martha, husband and wife, started off on an overhead projector back in, I think, the maybe early 80s, very early 80s or even late 70s. They used to hire out hotel rooms in America, travel across the country like salespeople, and provide these training courses for private pilots. At some point, someone said, why don't you try video? They did, and that's developed into one of the biggest. They've got 140 odd employees now, I think. I don't remember the specific number. No doubt we make mention of it in that podcast, but there are videographers and programmers and web designers and all sorts of things that occupy that space, and they're now well and truly a multi-million dollar company. So they're a good example, as it applies to digital. They're a good example of a couple of people that managed to take what was a very offline business and then transition with technology. So as technology evolved, they were clever enough to evolve with it. Now, that podcast probably goes for an hour and 20 minutes. I don't remember. But it's that 7 or 8 minute section in the middle where we talk about the evolution of their product that makes the most sense. The rest of it is just interesting. What else have we got there, Sunshine?
SP9er, what's that, Eric Moody?
SP9er, is that really how you read it?
Oh, that's what it looks like from
Speedbird 9er. British Airways, once again, British Airways, Boeing 747. And we spoke to Eric Moody. He was actually, I think, the very first podcast we did, the very first time we ever spoke to anyone. So we were all horrible. The sound quality was absolute garbage. It was just a difficult podcast to do. But Eric's story kind of softened the disappointment of the sound quality that eventuated. Now, he was flying a Boeing 747. I think it was Mount Kilimanjaro or something. I don't remember, but it was a volcanic eruption somewhere. And sadly, Eric Moody flew through the damn thing, and the 4 engines of his Boeing 747 failed and turned the Boeing 747 into a glider. I'll say that again, 4 engines. The Boeing 747 has 4 engines, and 4 engines failed, and that's an interesting story. He said once he survived that, once the aeroplane survived the insult, I guess, he was untouchable at British Airways. He could do whatever the hell he wanted to do. But an interesting guy. He does tell a whole bunch of really funny stories, but one of them, he said he was there in the 747. They had this ash blasting against the airplane. You can imagine it's like the Millennium Falcon flying through cyberspace. You just see these streaks of light. It's a very... I've not flown through volcanic ash myself, but I've heard stories. And Eric's is one of them. And he said he was there as all this was happening around him. He said, and I had 100 pounds in my back pocket And I thought to myself, what a waste. it's funny, isn't it? And then there's got to be a couple of other aviation ones there.
I can't read the other ones.
There's
Thorny or something? No, I can't see it.
No, but there are a whole bunch of them. I know Andrew Thorley's one of them. He's a friend of mine. We interviewed him. He was flying a ultralight over the western suburbs of Sydney. Had an engine failure at night. You're not allowed to fly ultralights at night. Over the suburb of Parramatta, landed in a football field, missed power lines by what would have been millimetres. And that's a fascinating story. He's an excellent operator, a great pilot, a good guy. Just this one experience sort of screwed him over on the day, and that's that. But there is one other story there somewhere that's fascinating. Surely you can...
No.
No?
I can't see it.
Oh, come on. Do I have to get up? Do I have to get up and look myself? I think I do.
Will, because they all look...
So we're going through John Bartels, Eric Moody. You know what? There's a couple there we just haven't written down. We've got at least 20 to 25 podcasts scheduled up on the board. Now, a large number of them have been recorded, so it's just a matter of packaging them up and pushing them out. And we'll be doing that over, in a very quick time frame, probably within 3 or 4 days, I suspect.
Yeah, well, they won't take long, yeah.
No, they won't take long. We don't put a huge amount of effort into our podcasts, do we? Actually, we really don't.
Well, they're pretty simple because they're already they're done. We're just doing the intro to them, really.
Those
So
aviation
nice
ones are simple. Yeah.
Oh, no, the other ones are going to take a bit of effort.
Well, no, we produced one. Well, this morning. This morning we did a Hello World. Now, we sat down for that and we had no idea what direction we were going to take it, and we just talked crap and it went for 3 hours.
Yep, and we still need to do a second one to that, which is going to be a closer look, because we didn't actually finish talking about everything we wanted to.
But that Closer Look podcast, guys, we've got a third podcast called A Closer Look, but that was always scheduled. We knew that we'd need a second one.
From past experience.
Yeah, from past experience of stuff. So, and that one we're possibly going to do this afternoon. 3 podcasts in a day. That's a lot of time. That's like 3, 4, plus another 3. That's 7 hours sort of sitting down on these couches talking crap. No wonder I'm just slurring my words. And
I feel sorry for the couch.
Guys, if you're interested in talking to us, we are actually a digital marketing agency. We have a social media and digital marketing software suite that supports finance brokers, mortgage brokers, financial advisors, accountants, real estate agents, and virtually any other business in existence. Not that you would have guessed from this podcast, but that's what we do. We provide really high yield digital marketing systems, and our systems and platforms and our tools are infinitely more effective than anything else on the market. We put a guarantee on that. So you have to listen to podcast number 1 and number 3, A Closer Look, to understand exactly why that is the case and how that is the case. If you're after more information, give us a call in Australia on 1300 235 433. That's 1300 235 433. That's Belief. If you do want to call locally, it's 028765 8886 is our sales number. You can visit our website at www.beliefmedia.com.au. Until next time, thank you for listening. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.